The Hearst family fortune is born in a California mining town where George Hurst discovers gold. Decades later, his son, William Randolph Hearst, builds an even greater fortune in a completely different industry, becoming America's first multimedia tycoon. But after 50 years of building his new empire, it's all threatened by a young and upcoming filmmaker, Orson Welles.
Well, who is he? Who does he think he is? He's a no one.
Who is inspired by Hearst's life story to make a movie called Citizen Kane. And Hearst vows to do everything within his power to fight back.
I can crush a man with a newspaper.
The year is 1880. The uneducated son of a Missouri farmer is one of the wealthiest men in America. His fortune comes from precious metals dug out of mines in the American West. His name is George Hurst.
The journey to the gold fields is not for the weak or faint-hearted.
As a young man, Hearst headed west from Missouri during the California Gold Rush, hoping to find his fortune buried within the earth.
I'll be damned.
Within 10 years, he becomes the most successful miner in the country.
George Hurst could look at the layout of the land and see things that other people didn't see. He just had this innate, instinctive ability to read the land.
In the decades that follow, Hearst owns an interest in the Comstock silver lode in Nevada, the Homestake gold mine in South Dakota, and the Anaconda copper mine in Utah.
His claim to fame is he had the biggest gold mine, silver mine, and copper mine in the Wild West all at the same time.
Hearst's net worth grows to over $20 million, the equivalent of $650 million today. Backed by his mining fortune, George Hurst sets his sights on becoming governor of California. And he makes a purchase he hopes will ensure his political future.
Listen, we've been friends for a while now. And as best as I can tell, you're broke. But I'm willing to make a deal. Give me the San Francisco Examiner. To a free press.
Hearst buys a local newspaper, planning to use it to boost his public profile and help him win the election.
The San Francisco Examiner was really a worthless rag. The only purpose for it was to try to drum up votes for George Hearst.
She's a pioneer of education for children.
While George Hearst plots his political future and oversees his vast mining operation, he has little time for his young wife, Phoebe.
When George met Phoebe, George was 22 years older than Phoebe. And Phoebe was a very cultivated woman.
It's the Golden Gate Kindergarten Association. It's truly a wonderful organization.
She was a school teacher, she wrote poetry, she liked fine art, and when she saw George Hearst, she was attracted not just to him, but to the world that he could open up for her. And he certainly did.
After months of campaigning, George Hearst's run for governor fails, and he continues to spend his time where he feels most comfortable, at his mines throughout the West. Phoebe is left alone in San Francisco to raise the couple's only child, William Randolph Hearst.
William Randolph Hearst led what looks to us from a distance as the most privileged, wonderful childhood. His father was absent all the time. Randolph's mother and the boy quickly formed a bond. His mother watched over him. He was the golden child.
Phoebe Hearst makes sure her son goes to the finest schools in America. At Harvard, William Randolph does everything but study.
Remember what I told you, right?
He had a personal valet. He had unbelievable beer parties. He had a grand time at Harvard. I don't know that he ever did any homework.
While his grades at Harvard suffer, Hearst begins to discover his true calling when he becomes the business manager of the Harvard Lampoon, the school's satirical magazine. He increases advertising revenue by 300% and improves circulation by 50%, turning the Lampoon into a profitable publication. Soon, William Randolph is spending most of his time studying the newspaper business. He becomes fascinated with a newspaper being published 200 miles to the south, where a giant of American journalism has taken over a New York paper called The World. His name is Joseph Pulitzer.
Pulitzer transformed journalism. Pulitzer understood that in order to get a large audience, you've got to not only report the news, but report the sports, the stock market, entertainment news, recipes and fashion for the women, and a little scandal for everybody.
Pulitzer's paper is an instant success, with the largest circulation of any American newspaper, and profits soar. Back at Harvard, young Hearst ultimately pays the price for ignoring his schoolwork.
The passing grade at Harvard was 50. Once you got in, it was nearly impossible to get thrown out. But Willie Hearst managed to do it.
Now Hearst needs to find his next move.
He fell in love with the Pulitzer product, and he decided at that point that He wanted to be a newspaper editor. Fortunately for him, his father owned a newspaper.
He returns home with a bold plan. Knowing that his father failed in his first run for office, William Randolph believes if he proves himself by using the San Francisco Examiner to help George get elected to the U.S. Senate, his father will let him take over the paper.
So you have the Examiner. Is there something the matter with one of the stories?
No, I've been thinking about what's not in this paper.
Oh, and what should be in the paper?
Well, I think it was truly a brilliant maneuver for you to acquire the paper, but I don't think we utilized it effectively.
Any second generation coming after something of great magnitude is a more pronounced struggle for people in that situation than for most of us. You know, they're thinking, how can they live a meaningful life on their own terms?
William Randolph immediately begins rebranding his father as a man of the people.
The Examiner would print letters supposedly from old mining chums of George, who would describe George Hearst's elegant backbone, this champion of the little guy. One could imagine William Randolph Hearst having a lot of fun writing those letters, pretending to be an old mining friend of his father's.
Got a cigar?
Need you to ask?
With the help of William Randolph's articles and months of campaigning, George Hearst finally achieves his goal. He is elected as California Senator, and he grants his son's request. On March 4th, 1887, the same day that George Hearst is sworn into office, the words W.R. Hearst, Proprietor, appear in the Examiner for the first time. Moving fast, the 24-year-old Hearst makes dramatic changes to the entire newspaper. With a fresh new look and more illustrations, he fires the old-timers and hires new reporters who write sensational, dramatic stories, featuring murders, shipwrecks, train wrecks, fires, and floods.
William Randolph Hearst sought to sensationalize the news. This was tabloid journalism in its earliest format.
Hearst masters every aspect of the publishing business, and the hard work pays off. Circulation doubles in the first year of Hearst's management.
They took this dilapidated newspaper and made it the foundation of his publishing empire.
But as William Randolph succeeds in remaking the Examiner into a profitable newspaper, doctors discover that his father has stomach cancer. And on February 28, 1891, George Hearst dies.
George Hearst established the largest mining corporation on Earth.
George Hearst created a model for William Randolph Hearst, someone with an extraordinary ambition, someone who would not take no for an answer.
George Hearst was one of the richest men in America, and his son is eager to inherit part of the family fortune. But George Hearst leaves it all to his wife, Phoebe. the news is devastating for his son.
Hearst thought in the beginning that eventually Phoebe would just give him half of it, hand over his portion, but no. Phoebe and her attorneys watched over every dime. They thought, we give him this money, he'll spend it on newspapers or God knows what else, and it'll be gone in a year. So all the money went to Phoebe.
Realizing that he's been passed over, William Randolph is determined to prove that he was worthy of his father's trust.
What William Randolph Hearst got from his father was to be extraordinarily ambitious and to be known as the best in his field. George Hearst was the best miner in United States history. William Randolph Hearst wanted to be the greatest newspaper man in United States history.
But to put his ambitious plans into action, Hearst needs the fortune controlled by his mother.
Why don't you leave those receipts for the accountants?
Oh, I'm just double checking.
Come sit with me.
Actually, Mother, I've been wanting to talk to you about an idea in the newspaper.
In 1895, New York is America's biggest newspaper market, and William Randolph wants a piece of it.
Hearst decided he wanted to go to New York, because New York was where the action was.
As owner of the newspaper, I can run it well. I can make the newspaper bigger than it ever was.
Hearst's mother agrees to provide $150,000 for the purchase of a failing New York paper, the New York Journal. Equipped with his family's checkbook, Hearst heads to New York with one thing in mind: to reign supreme over the American newspaper world. But one man stands in his way. Joseph Pulitzer, owner of The World, with a daily circulation of over 300,000. The very same man who had inspired Hearst to go into the newspaper business. Hearst knows that to win, he has to beat Pulitzer at his own game. And he has the money he needs to make that happen.
Hearst had resources that Pulitzer couldn't dream of to fight this war for supremacy in New York.
William Randolph Hearst out-Pulitzered Pulitzer. Hearst would offer more money if an editor would join the New York Journal and leave Pulitzer's world. And at one point, an editor said, well, I'd like to, but without my staff, I don't think I could accomplish anything. And Hearst said, well, let's bring the staff too.
Where's Jacobs?
He went to work at the Journal.
Kuntz? Harlow? Rowe?
They're all at the Journal. Hearst has him now.
Hoping to bankrupt his rival, Hearst lands another body blow. He begins printing as many pages as Pulitzer, but selling the Journal for just 1 cent, half the price of Pulitzer's World. To compete, Pulitzer is forced to drop the price of his paper. But Hearst can afford to lose money in the short term in order to bleed Pulitzer dry. Meanwhile, the competition for readers only becomes more intense.
They went head-to-head. They each sought to out-sensationalize the other, and they each tried to drive circulation any way they could. What we today call clickbait was what they were doing in selling their paper at 1 penny a copy, putting headlines on the paper that they thought people walking on the street could not resist.
It's a style of sensational, exaggerated, or baseless newspaper reporting that came to be known as yellow journalism.
It was called yellow journalism because the major cartoon in the Pulitzer paper was the Yellow Kid, and then Hearst created his own Yellow Kid. So because these cartoons were in full color and big and important, they called Pulitzer and Hearst the yellow journalists.
In 1898, a tragic event occurs in Havana, Cuba, and Hearst is eager to exploit it in his relentless quest to take down Pulitzer. An American battleship, the USS Maine, explodes and sinks while docked in Cuba, which at the time was a colony of Spain. 266 of the 354 crew members are killed. For Hearst, this is an opportunity to cause an uproar and boost sales of his newspaper. Hearst's journal jumps on the story, blaming Spain for the disaster, though the true cause is unknown.
We now know, after considerable investigation, that the ship blew up because of a problem in its engines. There was no clear evidence of Spanish activity that caused this explosion, but yet Hearst didn't care. Hearst decided it would be a powerful story to say that the Spanish had sunk this ship. In essence, the Spanish were at war with the United States, and President William McKinley was refusing to fight back. Those are the words that Hearst used.
Hearst is selling more and more newspapers, crushing Pulitzer. As the phrase "Remember the Maine" catches on with the public, and the story takes on a life of its own, Pulitzer has no choice but to follow Hearst's lead, whether or not the story is true.
Everyone was reading the New York Journal at this point. Pulitzer tried to follow suit, but he couldn't do it as well.
In April of 1898, President McKinley launches the Spanish-American War in both Cuba and the Philippines.
William Randolph Hearst didn't determine whether we went to war or not. That was a decision McKinley made. I think it's fair to say that Hearst put enormous pressure on McKinley to make a decision McKinley might not have made otherwise.
As America heads into war, circulation of the journal soars to 1 million copies. But Hearst and Pulitzer are spending a fortune to cover the war at the same time as they've reduced the cost of their papers, and the rivalry threatens to result in bankruptcy for them both. In December of 1898, the treaty ending the Spanish-American War is signed, and Cuba gains its independence from Spain. True to form, Hearst takes credit for America's victory.
Hearst was smart enough that once the nation went to war and the war was won, he said, "This is the journal's war. Hooray for us. If it wasn't for us, the Spanish would still be in Cuba, and the Cubans would still be under the yoke of this tyranny."
While the war remains controversial, the sacrifice of the almost 3,000 Americans who died in the conflict is beyond dispute. In the aftermath of the war, circulation declines for the World and the Journal. Both papers have lost money putting out special editions and sending reporters to cover the fighting from the front.
Mr. Hurst.
To stave off bankruptcy, Hearst and Pulitzer declare a truce. Pulitzer, embarrassed by his paper's sensational excesses, returns to a more traditional approach to the news. He spends the final decades of his life suffering from depression and nearly blind, but he keeps in touch with the editors on his newspapers. In his will, Pulitzer endows the prestigious Pulitzer Prizes. The awards preserve Pulitzer's legacy and represent the height of achievement in American journalism, scholarship, and the arts. Soon, William Randolph pursues a very different passion. While taking in a vaudeville performance, Hearst lays eyes on a young actress named Millicent Wilson, and he uses all of his wealth and celebrity to make her his own.
You are wonderful. By far the most beautiful person on that stage. Truly, truly fabulous.
The couple marries in 1903, when Hearst is 40 years old and Millicent is 21.
You know, he's a grown man. He's made a huge success, but he's still not behaving himself. Instead of getting married to a respectable gentry in New York, he starts going out with showgirls and marries one of them, Millicent Hearst, who becomes this grande dame of New York society.
Together, they will have 5 sons: George Randolph, William Randolph Jr., John Randolph, and twins, David and Randolph. Like his father, Hearst also pursues public office, running unsuccessfully for president, as well as mayor of New York. But he is unwilling to give up his political ambitions, and he uses his newspapers to speak directly to potential voters.
No one was ever mistaken about what Hearst thought. He put his editorials on the front page and signed them. They were his newspapers. And if you didn't like what he had to say, buy another newspaper. It was that simple. But people didn't buy another newspaper because he was a genius.
Hearst showed the power of journalism and the power of swaying opinion. Certainly he was the first one, I think, to exploit that.
In 1906, Hearst runs for governor of New York as a Democrat, staking out a position as a friend of the common man. Hearst wins the Democratic nomination, but he's soundly defeated by his Republican opponent. In the decade that follows, a time of business expansion, increased immigration, and reforms that improve conditions for working Americans, Hearst devotes himself to his growing empire. At its height, he owns 28 newspapers spread across the United States, including the Washington Times, the Chicago Examiner, the Detroit Times, and of course, the paper that started it all, the San Francisco Examiner.
His word went out to 30 million Americans on a daily basis, which is almost 25% of America's population.
As Hearst's career soars, his beloved mother, Phoebe, passes away.
It was not until he was in his 50s that his mother died, and he had control of the family fortune without having to go hat in hand to his mother. And how embarrassing that must have been for both of them.
Hearst decides to build an extraordinary new home that befits his role as a giant presence in American life. What will become known as Hurst Castle is built on land in San Simeon, California, that Hearst inherits from his mother.
William Randolph Hearst built a castle on the west coast of the United States, over thousands of acres. The edifice was unlike anything else that's ever been built. Hurst Castle is a monument unlike any others in the United States.
It's this extraordinary castle with the riches of Europe throughout. There are 3 guest houses. There are 2 pools. There are hundreds of acres. Beautiful land, going from a hill on top down to the ocean.
We have more than 300 exotic birds in the menagerie.
As he ages, Hearst takes a young mistress, an 18-year-old actress named Marion Davies.
Hearst is married. He has 5 children, but he falls in love with another young member of the chorus. She's beautiful, she's vivacious, she's smart as can be. Hearst falls in love with her, leads a double life.
It's all for you.
Despite Hearst's affair, he and his wife Millicent decide not to divorce.
At that time, the newspaper publishers agreed that you don't go into the personal affairs of a politician or of another press baron until it gets into the courts. If there's a divorce, then it's going to get into the courts and you can report about it. So Hearst lives this glorious life for him, and everybody's fine.
Over the years, Hearst Castle is host to Hollywood actors, musicians, and even leading politicians, including Winston Churchill. British playwright George Bernard Shaw remarks, "It's the kind of place God would have built if he had the money." And while the party at Hearst Castle rages on throughout the 1920s, Hearst is growing what will be America's first multi-platform media empire.
Before Hearst, newspaper publishers published newspapers. Magazine editors and publishers did magazines. The newsreels were a separate operation. Radio was a separate operation. Hearst brought them all together.
Capitalizing on the success of his Cosmopolitan magazine, Hearst creates Cosmopolitan Productions to turn magazine stories into feature films.
He invented this way of using talent across different media. He moves from platform to platform, from medium to medium, parlaying his wealth and his influence every step of the way.
Hearst uses his film company to help make his mistress, Marion Davies, a national star. In all, Hearst will spend $7 million to promote Davies' career, the equivalent of 130 million today, and she eventually enjoys success in comedies. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and soon the country plunges into the Great Depression. Over time, Hearst suffers major losses. Newspaper circulation drops, advertising revenues go down, and Hearst's own personal fortune is affected.
Hearst lost during the Depression when he could least afford to do it. He was already overcommitted. He had taken out too many loans. The banks started to call in those loans.
When President Franklin Roosevelt vows to increase taxes on the wealthiest Americans, Hearst's personal finances are further threatened. In response, he turns the full force of his journalistic empire against the president, labeling him a socialist and a dictator.
Hearst went ballistic. And from that moment on, FDR was the chief villain in all the Hearst papers and magazines, from coast to coast. In the newsreels.
This whole system of income taxation has degenerated into a racket.
The vitriol against FDR was such that his readers began to abandon him.
And as the power of Hitler and Mussolini takes hold in Europe, Hearst's political views are increasingly out of touch.
Hearst believed that the fascist regimes were doing some things right, and he criticized the United States, and in particular Britain and France, for being anti-Nazi.
Hearst's unpopular views cause further declines in circulation, and in 1937, with Hearst's personal and corporate debt spiraling out of control, he is forced to turn over control of his finances to a trustee approved by his creditors. Hearst is no longer in control of his empire. While his company is reeling on the brink of bankruptcy, Hearst faces an attack on another front. From a brash 24-year-old first-time movie director. His name is Orson Welles. Welles uses Hearst's life as inspiration for his debut film, Citizen Kane. The script is written by Herman Mankiewicz, a close friend of Marion Davies, and a frequent guest at Hurst Castle. But it's a harsh portrait of an aging mogul and his would-be opera star mistress.
Friend! Not the kind of friends I know. But of course I'm not high class like you, and I never went to any swell school.
That'll be enough, Susan.
Marion Davies was slandered in a way that is unforgivable. Welles made his mistress into this totally talentless bimbo. So it was a mean, nasty thing to do.
After learning about the film, Hearst fights back with every weapon at his disposal.
I can crush a man with a newspaper. You can't do that with a motion picture.
He tries and fails to get his friend Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM, to buy the film outright and burn the negative. And he doesn't stop there. Hearst orders his editors to run stories labeling Orson Welles a communist sympathizer and questioning his patriotism. Today, Citizen Kane is recognized as one of the greatest films ever made, but it was ahead of its time, and it was a box office bust, partly because of Hearst's relentless efforts to besmirch it. When America is attacked and the U.S. enters World War II, Hearst's papers support the war effort. Soon, wartime manufacturing helps to revive the economy. Circulation and advertising revenue increases. And by 1945, at the age of 82, Hearst regains control of his own finances. Hearst's empire is now smaller, but still formidable. With 17 daily newspapers, down from 28 at the peak of his power, he retains control of 9 of his 18 magazines and 4 of his 8 radio stations. But Hearst's health begins to fail.
He has a heart condition. He grows weaker and weaker. He lived for a couple of years longer, but as an invalid.
On the morning of August 14th, 1951, William Randolph Hearst dies.
William Randolph Hearst is as important as any other businessman or entrepreneur in the late 19th, 20th century because he invents the media mogul. He was the only man to take his fortune made in one medium, expand his company into a second medium and a third medium and a fourth medium, and, making a gazillion dollars doing it.
Hearst's wife, Millicent, receives nearly $75 million in today's dollars. Each of his 5 sons is guaranteed annual income of $350,000 in today's money, as well as stock in the Hearst Corporation. The Hearst family is not surprised that Hurst Castle and the surrounding lands are to be donated to the public. But in a shocker, Hearst leaves Marion Davies 30,000 shares of company stock, potentially giving her a controlling interest in the Hearst Corporation. But bowing to pressure from the family, Marion returns her shares. Following their father's death, Hearst's sons remain active in the Hearst Corporation and serve on its board. Under the leadership of a non-family member, Richard Berlin, the company revives legacy brands, including Popular Mechanics and Cosmopolitan Magazine, and acquires a publishing house and local television stations. Then, as unrest sweeps the nation in the 1970s, the Hearst family will find itself at the center of one of the biggest news stories of the decade. Randolph Hearst, age 58, together with his twin brother David, is one of William Randolph Hearst's 2 youngest sons.
While nominally still publisher of the San Francisco papers, Randy Hearst was not terribly important as anything but a corporate symbol.
Hearst's young daughter, Patty, is making plans to be married, and the family paper carries news of the engagement.
Patty Hurst, in early 1974, she was 19 years old, and she was a sophomore at Berkeley. She appeared a very normal, young American woman.
Patty's wedding announcement catches the eye of an obscure revolutionary group, which calls itself the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, whose headquarters are near Patty's apartment.
The Symbionese Liberation Army were a small group of individuals, of anarchists, who were opportunists. And they had organized themselves in Berkeley, California, to try to overthrow what they saw as an oppressive government in California and elsewhere.
On February 4th, 1974, 3 members of the group burst into Patty Hurst's apartment, intent on kidnapping the heiress. After a struggle, her fiancé escapes, but Patty is bound and stuffed into the trunk of a getaway car.
Within half an hour, she finds herself tied up in a dark closet someplace, and it was just everything had changed.
News of Patty's kidnapping quickly hits the airwaves.
Police here are puzzled as to a motive and feel that the kidnappers did know exactly who their victim was.
Patty's parents barricade themselves inside their mansion to avoid a mob of reporters.
Patty Hurst, even though she was the heir from this very wealthy family, she also seemed like the girl next door.
The kidnappers send a ransom note stating that Patty is a prisoner of war and demand that the Hearst family give $70 million worth of food to needy Californians, or she will be killed. The Hearst family quickly donates $2 million, but the kidnappers demand more.
Life is very precious to me.
In the coming days, the Hearst family receives a series of increasingly radical messages from Patty.
And I would never choose to live the rest of my life surrounded by pigs like the Hearsts.
Patty says her new name is Tanya, and her new occupation is urban guerrilla. Then, 2 months after being kidnapped, another shocking development. Accompanied by 4 other members of the SLA, Patty Hurst enters the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco, armed with a machine gun. Patty holds bank tellers at gunpoint, shouting, "This is Tanya, Patricia Hearst." The images of Patty Hurst wielding a machine gun are broadcast around the world.
That picture of Patty Hurst when she's holding the semi-automatic is one of the most powerful images you could ever see. It's absolutely astonishing.
And Randolph, son of the most powerful press baron of the 20th century, is powerless. The Hearst family has gone from covering the news to being the focus of it.
The story of her kidnapping went through many phases. At first, she was victim. But then, when recordings and video of her as an urban guerrilla who had joined her captors in robbing banks, then it entered phase 2. And that became the question. Was she brainwashed? Somehow, did they force her to think in a different way? Or was she embracing this crazy ideology of theirs?
In the following weeks, 2 members of the SLA are caught shoplifting. Patty responds by spraying the store window with machine gun fire and almost killing her fellow revolutionaries. For Patty's father, this is another devastating blow, and he finds it increasingly difficult to think of his daughter as a mere victim. After the Los Angeles police surround an SLA safe house, television cameras arrive equipped with new technology, enabling the scene to be broadcast on live TV. And the Hearst family, together with viewers around the country, watch as the shootout unfolds with an estimated 1,200 rounds fired. And the safe house burns to the ground.
This standoff in LA is one of the very first in American history's live criminal drama. It's a national type of drama on par with the Watergate hearings or the riots in Chicago in 1968. To have it happening live on TV was just unprecedented.
The bodies of 6 members of the SLA are pulled from the rubble. But Patty Hurst is not among them. And she continues to hide out amid reports that she's involved in more bank robberies and attempted attacks on law enforcement. During one bank heist, a 42-year-old mother of 4 is shot and killed. And the FBI places Patty Hurst on their most wanted list. Finally, on September 18, 1975, a year and a half after she was kidnapped, FBI agents acting on a tip arrest Patty Hurst. The Hearst family hires famed defense attorney F. Lee Bailey, and Patty's defense team paints her as a victim who's been brutalized, drugged, raped, and brainwashed.
She was told if she made one false move, she would be gunned down. At all times in the bank, others had the apparent ability to do that.
But the jury finds her guilty of armed robbery and other offenses. She is sentenced to 8 years in federal prison.
I think what you have to begin to understand before judging what Patty Hurst went through is this was a young woman with very little experience in the real world who was plucked out of a very nice life and put into a darkened closet where she was lectured and repeatedly raped for weeks.
Randolph Hearst uses his political connections, and President Jimmy Carter commutes Patty's sentence after she served only 22 months. 2 decades later, President Bill Clinton, in one of his final acts in office, grants Patty a pardon.
What obvious trauma she went through was not evident in the few public appearances that she's made over the years. She managed to live quietly, out of the public eye, and the few times she was in it, she didn't make too many waves.
Today, the San Francisco Examiner remains in print as a free daily newspaper. And Hearst Communications continues to thrive with an estimated annual revenue of $11.9 billion. Thanks to its newspapers, magazines, internet assets, and a partnership with the A&E television networks, plus a long-standing relationship with Disney, which includes a stake in ESPN.
George Hearst's legacy is William Randolph Hearst and everything William Randolph Hearst accomplished to better the old man.
Today, William Randolph Hearst III serves as chairman of the board of the Hearst Corporation. And the company continues to inform and shape society. It's a tradition of innovation that began with the company's founder over 135 years ago. And it all started with a fortune dug out of gold, silver, and copper mines in the American West.